Hi there, everyone. We have been reflecting together on what it means to be the people of God in the pandemic. And we began these reflections last week and concluded by asking the question, where ought we to begin? What is the best starting place, the beginning point for us? And that is most appropriately the Older Testament. How we read the Older Testament in particular. How are we to read it and understand it in a way that is in line with the way it was intended to be read and understood, and in a way that then properly brings it into appropriation into our lives and application in our lives. The prophet Amos said that whatever God was doing, he would reveal his secrets to his servants, the prophets. In these days of pandemic, as has been the case in other global, world, international type of situations, we have had plenty of so-called prophets telling us what those secrets supposedly are. And these range from the cause and effect pragmatists who say, well, it's all because the governments didn't prepare properly for the pandemic, to the strikingly detached moralizers who say it's all because the world needs to repent of sexual sin. And then we have the valid but separate, unrelated concerns. It's reminding us about the ecological challenges, the environmental crises, global warming. And we're sometimes left with the impression that the coronavirus is providing people with an opportunity, a platform, and a megaphone with which to say more loudly things that they were wanting to say all along anyway. Now, this is not to say that there are not significant and some rather obvious lessons to be learned from this. I, for instance, was recently listening to the story of a local resident here in our region who had just been released from hospital after a terrible but successful battle with COVID-19. He horrifically recounted the way the disease was literally leaving him breathless in an asphyxiated condition, unable to breathe. He had other persistent health issues which made him especially vulnerable, adding to his complications. But he shared firsthand how the disease runs rampant among those who are already in bad shape from other ailments, and thus likely not only to catch COVID-19 themselves, but to pass it on. I heard his heartfelt plea to listeners to exercise extreme care, even as we begin to take steps towards reopening. Exercise extreme care in this pandemic. It was a moving story. This, you see, was a hard-headed, feet on the ground, first-hand experience and perspective of what is actually going on. Not the sideways moralistic leap. Bad things are happening, say people. That's because abortion and LGBTQ plus issues. We need to get things right. That's not a good line of reasoning, not a good way to go. And so we are left wondering, how are we to think about these things? And particularly, how are we to be the people of God? And as the people of God, how are we to read the scriptures regarding these things, these thoughts? And how are we to read the Older Testament? In the Hebrew scriptures, the story of the people of God The greatest disaster of all was the Babylonian exile. And the great prophets interpreted that event in terms of the large-scale punishment for Israel's sin. This goes back to the covenant promises and warnings, to the blessings and curses in Deuteronomy. Books like Jeremiah and Ezekiel made it shockingly clear Israel had done what Deuteronomy said they shouldn't. In particular, worshiping pagan gods and idols and the behavior that goes along with that. And in consequence, God had done what God said he would do. The book called Lamentations, one of the most moving long pieces of biblical poetry ever written, looks out upon a city from which people have literally vanished. Here in my study, I have behind me a print of Rembrandt's depiction of Jeremiah, the author of Lamentations, sitting despondently and in despair as the city and the temple burn in the background. The lighting perhaps does not allow you to see the details of all of this, but the image has a haunting effect for me as I think about seeing images that we all remember seeing of the empty streets of our cities around the world, our own Metro Vancouver region. And we experienced these directly on our screens and through our media news feeds. Streets normally full and bustling with people, now more like ghost towns. And the prophet weeps. Jeremiah weeps for the innocent children crying for food and finding none. You can read it for yourself in Lamentations chapter 1, verse 12, and chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, and chapter 4, verse 4. I encourage you to do that. He's remembering the people's ancient traditions of faith, and that only seems to make matters worse for the prophet. But you, Lord, reign forever, he cries. Your throne endures for all generations. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? It sounds like the cries of the hearts of many people during this pandemic. Restore us to yourself, he goes on, that we may be restored, O Lord. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and you remain exceedingly angry with us. That's Lamentations 5, verses 19 to 22. These great prayers for restoration that we see throughout the Older Testament, they're quite explicit. Here we are in exile because we sinned, so now we turn to you and ask for forgiveness. Daniel chapter 9 is perhaps the clearest. Daniel 9, verses 9 and 10. So our line of thinking follows this framework, and we consider that if that is how it worked on the large scale for the people of God, then, or how it worked with the Babylonian exile, at least, then on the smaller scale, on the personal scale, on the scale of our lives here today, it looks as though it ought to be the same. There's an awful moment in 1 Kings when a widow losing her only son assumes that it's because of her sin. Now, this was a common idea in the ancient world, this retribution idea, this retribution principle, this transactional notion of relationship with God. So because of her sin in having the prophet Elijah staying under her roof, She thinks that she has somehow triggered her son's death as a punishment for her sin. You can look at this in 1 Kings chapter 17. Well, Elijah, raising the boy to life, immediately puts that vile suggestion back where it belongs. Even so, the rumor still persists that ill fortune and ill behavior are always linked in a straightforward causal chain. Psalm 1 informs us that good people will flourish and wicked ones will come to a bad end. Psalm 37, which in some ways is an extension of this same theme, has the striking verse 25, which says, "Once I was young," the poet writes, "and now I am old, yet I have never seen the godly abandoned or the righteous forsaken or their children begging for bread." But we sharply and quickly inhale because we have seen them on our streets, at our borders internationally, on our hearts. We should probably allow the psalmist the benefit of the doubt here. He's describing normal times. Play fair and things will work out, mess around and trouble will come, as was the thought of the day. But we don't live in normal times, and perhaps we never really have. What do we say then? Try explaining to someone who's dying of COVID-19 in a crowded refugee camp that all of this is because of sin. Blame the victim, in other words. That's always a popular and effective line. Fortunately, for our sanity, and in light of our desire and our pursuit of biblical inspiration and authority and interpretation and appropriation, our pursuit to properly understand all of these things, there's a more well-rounded picture for us. Take Psalm 73. The writer knows the normal line. Good things come to good people, bad things to bad. Again, that idea of retribution and transactional relationship. But in Psalm 73, it hasn't worked out like that. The wicked are flourishing, and the righteous are, in fact, the ones being crushed underfoot. It's only when the poet finally enters God's temple that a larger, more transcendent, healing viewpoint can be perceived. Then go to Psalm 44, our passage from last week, which specifically denies the good things bring good and bad brings bad viewpoint. The poet knows that God has faithfully looked after his people in times past. But now truly horrible things have happened, despite the fact that they are people who have kept covenant with God. They have not forgotten him. They are still desirous of him. Interestingly, Paul quotes Psalm 44 in that famous passage, Romans 8, and that infamous verse 28, all things work together. He quotes Psalm 44 in the greater context of that passage. We are seen as lambs lined up to be slaughtered. We'll visit that more closely later on. There are other psalms which also state the problem and leave it with a kind of puzzled shrug of the shoulders. Beloved, how are we to think about these things? All of these psalms and the prophets, they become the foothills for us of an already gloomy and frightening horizon, and yet we sense a darker mountain even looming behind them. It's called the Book of Job. And we'll look at these things. I'm leaving you hanging here, but hold fast. We're going to look at these more closely. God bless.